Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, a really compelling framework, navigating the territory between order and chaos. We're looking at the ideas Jordan Peterson has popularized, thinking about that deep, sort of mythological structure of the hero's journey. And we want to apply it directly to something very real for many people, the struggle for psychological resilience, especially in recovery. Yeah, our focus today, our mission, if you like, is really practical. How does this map onto the journey of recovery, whether that's recovery from addiction, or maybe trauma, or even just feeling fragmented, lost? We're framing addiction here as, let's say, a descent into a kind of highly structured, self-perpetuating chaos. And recovery, well, that's the heroic journey, isn't it? Confronting that chaos, finding what's worth saving, and building a new, more resilient order in your life. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources today, sources that map this journey from like the cellular level right up to our social connections. The idea is to help you think about becoming the hero of your own story.
It is a powerful metaphor, and I think it resonates because it taps into something psychologically very real. Our sources definitely back this up. Chaos isn't just, external messiness, cluttered life or whatever. It's fundamentally a state of internal conflict, internal instability. And what's really quite striking, as some clinical observations point out, is that serious pathology can actually look like an organized chaos.
Organized chaos. How does that work?
Well, the idea is the system, your psychological system, it manages to restructure itself to survive an immediate threat, okay? But it does so on a really unstable foundation. So it establishes this kind of equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium where the symptoms, the problems are actually preserved, and the potential for real growth gets shut down.
That distinction feels critical. Organized chaos. It suggests you're not just passively failing, are you? You're actively, maybe unconsciously, but actively maintaining that instability. So if we accept that chaos starts internally, what does that initial state actually look like, feel like, psychologically, biologically, before recovery even starts? Yeah. When Peterson talks about the birth of psychological chaos and maps of meaning, he talks about this clash, doesn't he? A clash of fundamental biological goals. He gives that really intense example, being simultaneously lustful and guilty, or cold, thirsty, and frightened. That really captures feeling, well, torn apart inside.
Exactly. That internal friction, that's what psychologists mean by intrapsychic conflict. We're not these perfectly unified beings, are we? We're driven by all these specialized subsystems inside us, and often they compete. So when these systems clash, one part wants immediate pleasure, another part is worried about the future costs. They can't agree on what's the most important thing right now, and that leads to emotional dysregulation. It's this really uncomfortable state of instability, and the individual tries desperately to stop feeling that way, often by any means necessary.
Which is where destructive habits can come in, right?
Right.
As a way to manage that internal feeling.
Precisely. They often start as attempts at internal regulation, however maladaptive. And we can see this really clearly at the physiological level, especially with trauma. Peter Levine's work is fascinating here. He describes trauma not just as the scary event itself, but as the pathology that comes from the incompletion of the survival response. The body gears up to fight or flee, but something stops it.
He calls it the Medusa complex, right?
Yeah.
That freezing response.
That's it. The initial failure of the rational brain to override instinct leads to that freeze. You're paralyzed by fear. But all that survival energy, mobilized for fight or flight, it doesn't just disappear. It doesn't complete its cycle. It gets locked in the body. You end up with this persistent high-level charge.
That's a huge insight, because it totally reframes what happens next.
Yeah.
If that energy is trapped, where does it go? What does it do?
It gets channeled into symptoms. Because the sort of older parts of the brain, the reptilian brain, govern basic life functions, sleeping, eating, sexuality, just general activity levels. Those functions become fertile ground for pathology. That's how you might end up with things like anorexia or chronic insomnia or maybe manic hyperactivity. The person is essentially using trapped survival energy to fuel these destructive patterns. And that's why just telling someone in that state to calm down or snap out of it is utterly useless. Their body is still fighting a war that ended maybe years ago.
Which leads us straight into how this chaos perpetuates itself. The body's trying to find safety, but in this really primitive, compromised way. And that struggle feeds back into the brain, making sure the chaos continues. It's a loop.
Exactly right. And the Polyvagal theory helps us understand the neurobiology of that loop. Stephen Porges explained how when our autonomic nervous system gets stuck in that state of mobilization, the fight or flight pathway, the sensory information coming from our internal organs, what's called afferent feedback, it literally colors how we perceive the outside world.
Afferent feedback. So signals from the gut, the heart, lungs going to the brain.
Precisely. So if your stomach is churning, your heart's pounding, your breath is shallow, those biological signals are screaming danger, immediate danger to your brain. And this internal alarm system, it can actually override objective reality. You become biologically primed to see the world as threatening, even if the external situation is neutral or even positive.
Wow. So your own body's betraying your perception.
In a way, yes, it compromises your ability to pick up on positive social cues. So you might withdraw or become aggressive, even when friends or family are genuinely trying to connect or help. And that's how chaos becomes self-perpetuating. Your internal biology makes you see threats everywhere, which reinforces the feeling that you need to stay mobilized, stay vigilant, stay, well, unstable. Hashtag tag, hashtag B, tracks of behavior and identity, in chaos.
Okay, so the individual is trapped in this internal state, this mobilized fear, leading to fragmented actions. But why do so many attempts to change, to recover, fail so early on? People start with huge determination, they make some changes, and then poof, they stop. James Clear calls this hitting the valley of disappointment.
Ah, the valley of disappointment. It's such a common experience, and it stems from expecting progress to be linear when, in reality, most meaningful change involves compounding. People start making small, positive changes, maybe meditating for 5 minutes, going to one support meeting, but they quit because they don't see big, obvious results right away. The truth is, the really powerful outcomes of any compounding process, whether it's investing money or building habits, are delayed.
Right, it takes time for those small actions to accumulate and reach a tipping point.
Exactly. Think about someone recovering from, say, chronic depression or an addiction. They might stay sober or stick to a good sleep routine for 2, maybe 3 weeks, but inside, they might feel exactly the same, or maybe even worse, dealing with withdrawal or the discomfort of change. And that frustration, that feeling of I'm putting in all this effort for nothing, makes them give up just before they break through what Clear calls the plateau of latent potential. That valley is the gap between the effort you put in early and the delayed, significant results. Change happens slowly, then all at once.
That makes a lot of sense psychologically. But what about the behavioral side? If the issue is choosing the drug or the destructive habit, why do we always default to blaming things like lack of willpower or weak character?
Well, this is where B.F. Skinner offers a really challenging, but I think crucial perspective for recovery. Skinner argued that if we want a scientific analysis of behavior, we have to shift our focus. We need to move away from these internal, hard-to-pin-down things like character traits or states of mind and look instead at the accessible conditions of the environment.
Accessible conditions.
Yeah.
Meaning things we can actually see and change.
Exactly. And his key insight was about causality. The environment doesn't push or pull our behavior like some kind of magnet. Instead, it selects behavior. Think of it like natural selection in biology. Over time, advantageous traits get selected. Similarly, environments select for certain behaviors. So, for someone struggling with poor choices, the solution isn't just telling them to find more willpower. That's an internal variable they often can't directly control. The solution is to deliberately arrange the external conditions so that they naturally select for better, healthier behaviors.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If you always walk past a specific bar on your way home from work and that's a trigger for you, well, you've arranged your environment to select for temptation. Changing your route home literally removes that environmental selector. Suddenly, the recovery effort shifts from being about some kind of moral feeling I'm too weak to being a solvable design problem, an architectural problem.
But hang on. If the environment selects the behavior, doesn't that kind of erase personal responsibility? The very thing Peterson emphasizes in The Hero's Journey. How do we square that scientific determinism with the need for agency? That's the absolute core tension, isn't it? And it's something we really need to grapple with in this deep dive. Skinner wasn't saying we have no agency. He argued that the traditional idea of the autonomous man, this purely internal being who controls everything from within, is probably an illusion. But recognizing that doesn't eliminate agency. It shifts it. True agency from this behavioral viewpoint lies in the deliberate organization of your environment. You gain control not by constantly fighting your internal urges with willpower, which, as we've said, might be the mechanism that's failing, but by consciously choosing the environment that makes the better choice more likely, maybe even automatic.
So choosing the constraints that ultimately make you free.
You could put it that way, yes.
Yep.
We choose the constraints that guide us toward the freedom we want. Okay. This sets us up for what might be the most devastating consequence of deep internal chaos, the loss of identity itself. When the internal structure collapses, the self can collapse too. What does that look like neurologically in really extreme cases?
Oliver Sacks provides some truly harrowing descriptions of this. His work with patients suffering from Korsakoff syndrome, particularly the case of Mr. Thompson. It's unforgettable. Mr. Thompson had profound amnesia. He couldn't remember anything for more than a few seconds, his past, his present, constantly dissolving. And to cope with this terrifying flux, he would constantly improvise. He'd create this quasi-coherence, as Sacks called it, through nonstop confabulations, these quick-fire fictional narratives.
He wasn't lying intentionally. He believed these stories.
In that fleeting moment, yes. He was literally inventing a world around himself, a new job, a new identity, a new scenario that felt completely real and logical to him right then. But Sacks pointed out that this incredible gift for invention was also his damnation. This constantly shifting, improvised reality became the ultimate barrier to forming any real meaning, any stable relationship with reality, or even himself. The result of that kind of fragmented consciousness is what Sacks termed an existential casualty. It's the loss of the very capacity for genuine feeling, for continuity. It renders the person, in his words, desouled. He'd lost the body ego, that fundamental sense of self anchored in physical reality.
That loss of a continuous life story, anchored in reality, that's the ultimate internal chaos. And restoring that must be the core goal of recovery.
Absolutely. Rebuilding that narrative coherence is paramount.
Okay, so if the descent is marked by that fragmented identity, by these maladaptive, often self-deceiving behaviors, then the hero's task, the recovery journey, must start with establishing simple, observable structure, repeatable structure. We need like an architectural blueprint for the new self.
And behavioral science gives us exactly that blueprint. James Clear's 4 laws of behavior change aren't just helpful tips. They really are the architectural framework for building order. Why? Because they work with human nature, not against it. Clear points out that any goal is basically doomed to fail if it goes against the grain of human nature, like expecting massive results overnight or relying on overcoming huge amounts of friction constantly. These laws help us organize our environment so that it starts selecting the right behaviors almost automatically.
Let's unpack those. It feels really important to get specific here, especially thinking about how they reverse the chaos we've been talking about. What are the 4 laws, and how do they build this new order?
Right. Think of them as the 4 rules for making good habits, the habits of order easy and making bad habits, the habits of chaos difficult or even impossible.
Okay, law 1.
First, the cue. Make it obvious. Chaos often thrives in ambiguity, doesn't it? Order demands clarity, visibility. So if you want to start a new recovery habit, maybe journaling, maybe meditating, maybe preparing a healthy meal, the cue for that habit needs to be right there. Unavoidable. If your journal's hidden away in a drawer somewhere, good luck forming the habit. If you want to go to an early meeting, you need your keys, your wallet, maybe your clothes laid out right where you'll see them when you wake up. Make the trigger obvious.
Got it. Law 2.
Second, the craving. Make it attractive. We are naturally drawn to things that feel good, that promise some kind of reward. If a recovery activity feels like pure punishment, like sheer drudgery, we're just not going to stick with it long term. So we need to leverage this. A key technique here is temptation bundling. You pair an action you want to do, maybe listen to your favorite podcast, watch an episode of a show, have a specific treat only while you're doing an action you need to do for your recovery, like exercising or maybe tidying your space or driving to that support group. The ritual itself becomes more attractive because there's an immediate reward linked to the action, not just some distant hoped-for outcome.
Okay, that makes sense. The third law feels like it directly tackles that feeling in chaos, where everything, even tiny tasks, feels like climbing a mountain. The friction problem.
Precisely. Law 3 is the response. Make it easy. Chaos creates maximum friction. Order demands minimum friction. The goal here is simply to reduce the number of steps, the amount of effort between you and the good habit. This is where the 2-minute rule is incredibly powerful, especially early in recovery. You take the habit you want to build and you scale it down until it takes 2 minutes or less to complete. So if your goal is read more books, start by reading 1 page. If your goal is meditate for 30 minutes, start by meditating for 1 minute. If your goal is stop drinking, the first step might be ensuring there is absolutely 0 alcohol easily accessible in your home. Make the start ridiculously easy. Why? Because it guarantees compliance. You do the thing, and doing the thing, even the tiny version, starts building the identity or someone who does that thing. It builds momentum, even if the action feels trivial at first.
And the final law, completing the loop.
Yes. Law 4, the reward. Make it satisfying. This is crucial. The reward needs to feel immediate. Our brains are wired for immediate gratification. Relying solely on long-term benefits like, I'll be healthier in 6 months, often isn't enough to keep the behavior going day to day. In recovery, you need that immediate reinforcement. A satisfying reward acts like a signal to your brain, hey, that thing you just did, that was good, do it again. Right. This could be something simple, like tracking your progress, putting a big X on a calendar, moving a paperclip from one jar to another, or it could be a small, non-destructive treat immediately after you complete the desired action. It closes the habit loop and reinforces the identity shift. I am the kind of person who follows through.
Okay, so we're building the external structure with these laws, making the actions happen. But what about the internal landscape, the mind that's still carrying the trauma, the conflicting goals? How does the mind catch up? This sounds like where we need Jonathan Haidt's rider and the elephant analogy comes in. The rational rider needs to start steering the emotional elephant.
That analogy is perfect for this. In the state of chaos, that massive emotional elephant is terrified, it's confused, it's running wild, and it's completely ignoring the tiny rider's attempts to direct it. Cognitive therapy, in many ways, is designed precisely to train that rider, not to control the elephant through brute force that rarely works, but to guide it gently, consistently, using small reinforcements.
How does that work in practice?
Yeah.
Training the rider.
It involves systematically becoming aware of those distorted automatic thoughts. Those irrational, often negative scripts that pop into your head and fuel the chaotic feelings. I'm useless, this will never work, everyone hates me. You learn to catch them, examine them, maybe give them a name, there's my inner critic again, and then actively test them against reality. Does the evidence really support this thought? This takes daily practice. It's not a one-off fix. And it often involves small, reinforced tasks specifically designed to challenge those thoughts and gradually change the underlying affective style, the general emotional tone. For someone battling deep inertia or depression, maybe just getting out of bed, taking a shower, and successfully going to the shop to buy a newspaper is a huge victory. Each small win like that is like, as Haidt suggests, giving the elephant a peanut as reinforcement for trying a new, healthier behavior. It slowly builds trust between the rational mind and the emotional system.
And this practice, it changes how you see causality too.
Yeah.
Your role in things.
Massively. Alfred Adler made a really insightful point about this. He noticed that if a patient, say, stops making the characteristic errors that seem to stem from their past, maybe someone who was overly pampered as a child learns to be independent, then the argument that the pampering mother was the fixed determining cause just collapses. The cause only seemed absolute as long as the errors, the maladaptive patterns, were being repeated. Realizing this is incredibly empowering for recovery. It shifts the locus of control. It says, okay, my past definitely contributed to where I am now, but I am responsible for the direction I choose today. The past doesn't have to dictate the future state. #B, the secure base and social support.
That makes sense. You start taking responsibility for the future. Now, the classic hero's journey often pictures the hero alone, right? Slaying dragons solo. But for a truly resilient order, one that can actually withstand future chaos, it seems like external support is vital. The sources really emphasize connection. Can you talk about this idea of a secure base in our adult relationships?
Yes, the secure base concept is fundamental, drawing originally from attachment theory with children, but applied powerfully to adult relationships by researchers like Brooke Feeney. The research is pretty clear. Secure attachment, having that reliable base, actively helps us rebuild ourselves. A secure partner functions as that safe home you can return to, which then gives you the confidence to go out and explore the world, take risks, pursue difficult personal goals, like recovery. Feeney found that when partners actively support these exploratory opportunities, they offer encouragement, reassurance, maybe practical help without taking over. The person reports significantly higher self-esteem, better mood, and crucially, they rate their chances of actually achieving their goals much higher. They feel more capable because they know they have that safety net.
But support needs to be the right kind of support, doesn't it? Not controlling.
Exactly. That's key. If a partner is overbearing or critical or maybe just subtly unsupportive, the individual tends to shrink their goals. They become less open about what they're trying to achieve. They retreat back towards safety instead of exploring that edge between order and chaos where growth happens. So the secure base provides comfort, yes, but it also provides that gentle encouragement, that confidence boost to venture out and integrate new, potentially challenging territory into your life and identity.
Okay, but let's be real. Relationships themselves can be a huge source of chaos, can't they? Especially if partners have really different needs around closeness and intimacy. How do you avoid getting stuck in that kind of relationship chaos?
You're pointing to the notorious anxious avoidant trap. This is a really common dynamic, unfortunately. It happens when one partner has high needs for intimacy and reassurance, they have an anxious attachment style, and the other partner feels uncomfortable with too much closeness, maybe finds it engulfing, they have an avoidance style. The big problem is that their fundamentally different, incongruent needs for intimacy eventually threaten to take over every conversation. Every interaction becomes about negotiating closeness and distance. And this inevitably leads to chronic misunderstanding, frustration, and much lower relationship satisfaction for both.
And it can become a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. What's particularly insidious is how it often plays out. Sometimes the anxious person might try strategies like playing hard to get or suppressing their real need for connection, maybe based on popular dating advice. Paradoxically, this behavior can sometimes attract the avoidant partner initially because it allows the avoidant person to control the level of closeness entirely on their terms. They get to pursue when they feel distant and pull back when they feel close. This sets up a painful feedback loop for the anxious person. They get a brief hit of connection when the avoidant partner pursues, followed by the inevitable withdrawal, which just reinforces their core anxiety and keeps the whole relationship unstable. Building a resilient shared order requires both people to eventually act in line with their genuine needs, while also learning to respect the other's different needs and boundaries.
That sounds incredibly difficult to navigate. Now, another thing people often fear in recovery is conflict. Any argument feels like slipping back into total chaos. They might think a good or healed relationship should have no fighting at all. What does the research say about conflict within a secure base?
That's a huge misconception, and it sets people up for disappointment. John Gottman's extensive research on couples shows very clearly fighting is inevitable. Even the happiest, most secure couples disagree, sometimes intensely. What distinguishes the couples who maintain that resilient order, who stay connected through difficulties, isn't whether they fight, but how they fight, and crucially, how they repair the connection afterwards. Conflict, managed well, can actually deepen the bond. But the key is that during the disagreement, each partner needs to communicate somehow a basic underlying acceptance of the other person. You're arguing about the issue, not attacking the person's entire character.
So focus on the problem, not the person.
Exactly. Secure principles mean you stick to the specific issue at hand. You don't let it escalate into you always, or you never, or threats to leave. Gottman famously emphasized that before you can even ask your partner to change something, you absolutely must make them feel heard and understood first. When conflict is handled like that with mutual respect, focusing on the problem, and prioritizing repair and understanding the relationship itself becomes a kind of living model for how to navigate the inevitable chaos of life without falling apart. It builds resilience together.
All right, so we've talked about building the external behavioral structure using the 4 laws and establishing that external support system, the secure base. The final phase seems to be about consolidating this new order internally, moving beyond just changing behaviors to really consolidating a new identity. Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion seems really relevant here. She talks about it having 2 faces, right? Not just softness, but also strength.
Yes, this dual approach, what she calls tender and fierce self-compassion, is absolutely essential for making the changes last, especially for anyone who's dealt with deep shame or the chaos of trauma. Tender self-compassion is probably what most people think of first. It's about bringing a loving, connected presence to our own suffering, and it has 3 main parts.
Okay, what are they?
First is kindness. Simply being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than whipping ourselves with self-criticism, treating ourselves like we treat a good friend. Second is common humanity, recognizing that suffering and personal inadequacy are part of the shared human experience. Everyone struggles. You're not alone or uniquely flawed in your difficulties. This combats isolation. And third is mindfulness. This means holding our painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness, acknowledging them without suppressing them, but also without exaggerating them or getting swept away, just being present with the pain without needing to immediately fix it. Together, these provide the safety needed for healing.
That covers the tender aspect, the comforting part. But the hero's journey often involves facing down challenges, confronting difficulties. Where does the strength, the courage come from in this model?
That's fierce self-compassion. This is the protective, provisioning, motivating aspect. It's the courage to say no, to draw boundaries, to stand up for yourself, to protect yourself from harm, whether that harm is external or self-inflicted. Therapies like compassion-focused therapy, CFT, explicitly work with both. This dual approach provides what some call a compassionate armor. It gives you the internal safety needed to finally process painful past experiences, maybe trauma. But it also gives you the backbone, the assertiveness to challenge harmful patterns, like maybe chronic self-sacrifice or people-pleasing that often fueled chaos in relationships or keeps people stuck. The new stable order requires both nurturing and assertion.
It sounds like this could be the very mechanism for integrating that internal chaos we talked about earlier, harnessing that trapped survival energy instead of being controlled by it.
I think that's exactly right. It provides the container for integration. Peter Levine, again, talks about healing trauma as uniting these fundamental polarities. He uses the terms heaven, meaning expansion, vitality, life energy, and hell, the contraction, the frozen state, the trapped energy, and the bridge between them is the felt sense, the bodily awareness, that survival energy that got locked into symptoms back in part one. Through practices grounded in self-compassion and body awareness, it can now be gently accessed and discharged. It's a gradual process, what Levine calls renegotiation. It's the human body's way of finally completing that fight-or-flight response that got interrupted.
And what does that look like, that discharge?
It can manifest in subtle ways, maybe small tremors, feeling heat or cold, taking sudden deep breaths, sometimes involuntary movements or emotional releases like crying or even laughing. It's the body letting go. By allowing this gentle, energetic discharge to happen, the psychic polarities start to integrate. The person begins to move away from being defined or controlled by the trauma's power, which Levine says can rob our lives of vitality. Instead, they can successfully use that resolved experience, that integrated energy, for powerful self-renewal and transformation. The chaos doesn't just vanish, its energy gets repurposed. It becomes fuel for life again. Hashtag B. Finding a purposeful place in the world.
Okay, so integration happens. The final step then in this heroic journey seems to be finding a sense of meaning that goes beyond just feeling okay, beyond mere functionality, a meaning that lasts. The new resilient order isn't just about stability for stability's sake, is it? It seems to involve finding necessary constraints and maybe a purpose that feels worthwhile. How do we differentiate the temporary highs or reliefs found in chaos from the deeper satisfaction of purpose?
That's a great question. We can look to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, but maybe view it slightly differently through the lens of value. Maslow observed something really interesting. He found that individuals who have experienced gratification of both their lower needs, like basic physical safety, food, shelter, and their higher needs, like self-esteem, belonging, self-actualization, finding meaning, almost universally regard the satisfaction of the higher needs as more valuable, more fulfilling. They will actually sacrifice more for the higher satisfaction. They find it easier to tolerate deprivation at the lower levels, maybe endure hardship, hunger, social disapproval, if it's in service of a principle, a purpose, something they deem truly meaningful. So you could say the chaos-driven self tends to optimize for low-value, immediate gratification, whereas the emerging ordered self starts to optimize for high-value, durable meaning.
That makes sense. And this connects to finding a stable place through productive work, doesn't it? Freud talked about this.
He did, yes. Freud argued that work, particularly freely chosen work that allows for what he called sublimation, plays a vital role in the economy of the individual libido, basically, in managing our psychic energy and drives. By sublimation, he meant channeling powerful, sometimes socially tricky drives, maybe aggressive impulses, narcissistic needs, erotic energy towards a socially acceptable and constructive end. Think about pouring that energy into building a business or mastering a craft or diving deep into research.
So work isn't just about paying the bills, it's actually a psychological anchor.
According to Freud, yes. He argued that perhaps no other technique binds the individual so firmly to reality as focusing on work within the human community. It provides a structured outlet, a secure place. It replaces the potentially chaotic, purely self-serving pursuit of raw pleasure with engagement in an objective reality, one that offers measurable progress, tangible results, and a sense of communal worth. Even if, as he noted, many people undertake work reluctantly, its potential value for grounding the self is immense.
Now, if we zoom out again to this bigger picture of creating order, achieving it isn't about becoming some isolated hermit controlling every variable, is it? It seems to require embracing necessary external constraints, which feels almost counterintuitive to our modern obsession with total freedom.
It does feel counterintuitive, but it's a powerful sociological insight backed by research. Emil Durkheim, in his classic studies on suicide way back, made a striking observation. He found that groups who had fewer social constraints, fewer bonds, fewer obligations holding them together, actually had substantially higher suicide rates. This points to the paradox of freedom and meaning. Absolute, unconstrained freedom, where nothing is required of you and anything goes, can lead to a state of anomie, a sense of normlessness, rulelessness, psychological dissolution. Because if there are no boundaries, ultimately nothing you do really matters.
So constraints give life shape, meaning
Exactly. Constraints like social roles, family responsibilities, work obligations, community involvement, these things provide structure and meaning. They give life shape and direction. They prevent us from becoming excessively dependent on purely private, fleeting interests and ground us in shared realities. The hero returning from the underworld of chaos understands this. Structure, boundaries, rules, responsibilities isn't fundamentally a restriction on freedom. It's the necessary condition that secures freedom, anchors the self, and gives life purpose and vector. And ultimately, this ties back to what Carl Jung suggested about integrating the self. He argued we cannot just cut loose from our archetypal foundations, those deep collective stories and patterns that shape our unconscious without risking neurosis, fragmentation. The final task isn't about erasing the past or becoming someone totally new. It's about finding a new interpretation of those foundations, one that's appropriate for who you are now. It's about connecting the life of the past, which still exists within you, with the life of the present and the potential of the future. This conscious connection prevents that rootless consciousness that's so susceptible to being overwhelmed by personal or collective chaos. Hashtag outro.
wow. Okay, so this deep dive into the journey from chaos to order, it's really mapped out a process. It involves specific intentional shifts, doesn't it? We start with the chaotic self, defined by those clashing biological impulses, the trapped energy, the maladaptive behaviors, and the order itself emerges by shifting focus from those elusive internal states like willpower towards observable processes using things like the 4 laws of behavior change. It involves building a more reliable internal narrative through cognitive restructuring and establishing safety externally through secure relationships and internally through self-compassion.
Exactly. I think the core takeaway is really about recognizing the self as an organized system. That old idea of the purely autonomous man who succeeds or fails based solely on internal grit, well, it's largely an illusion when you're dealing with profound chaos. True freedom, especially in recovery, seems to be achieved by deliberately, consciously reorganizing the entire environment and your internal systems, the whole architecture of your life, really to favor resilient behavior. You move from being a passive victim of the chaos that just happens to you to becoming the active architect who reorganizes the self around meaning, purpose, and durable structure.
That tension, that dynamic between internal agency making the self stronger and external structure making the path easier leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. B.F. Skinner, as we discussed, basically contended that a scientific analysis shifts all the credit and the responsibility for behavior onto the environment. His implication: make the path to order architecturally inevitable. Conversely, Freud argued that happiness is fundamentally a problem of the individual's internal psychic economy, and ultimately, everyone has to find their own salvation. His implication: make the self unbreakable. So the question for you is this. Given that the initial descent into chaos so often involves a failure of internal self-regulation, how much of your own heroic journey should be dedicated to maximizing environmental control engineering your world so the new order is almost guaranteed, versus how much should be dedicated to maximizing internal agency, forging a self so resilient it can withstand whatever chaos life throws its way? Where does the balance lie for you?